All right, we're going to go ahead and get going. So thank you for being here. My name is Lawson Bader. I'm president of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. If you're not here for the panel and Friends in Low Places, How Cronyism Corrupts the Free Market, go ahead and stay. Well, we're glad to have you here. So it's a great title. I'm not sure if Garth Brooks would approve, but Garth Brooks isn't here, so I'm not really worried about it. So we're talking about cronyism, which, you know, for many people, their awareness of this sort of began in 2008 with the bailout of the financial services industry, even though it goes back a lot further. And there's some interesting parallels, if I can actually say this publicly, between the Occupy Wall Street and the Tea Party movement. There's not a lot, but one of them is actually their collective opposition to sort of the government bailing out wealthy and connected banks. Now, their motivation's very different, frankly. The Tea Partiers sort of viewed it correctly, I might add, as interfering with free enterprise and free market. For the occupiers, it's sort of a taxpayer-financed gift for wealthy executives who, frankly, are the ones that created the first place. We know that narrative exists a long time. Shannon's got to deal with that narrative all the time on that issue. But the truth is that the 2008 bailout, and of course the other bailouts with the auto industry and airlines, et cetera, are sort of but one long list of a lot of privileges that the government bestows on certain industries and certain entities. And the others are subsidies and monopoly status and protection from foreign competition and contracts that are non-competitive in how they bid and loan guarantees and favorable regulations, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a long list of things. Well, if you want the problem in 10 seconds in an economic lesson, it's this. Cronyism, defined by the special privilege, really fundamentally destroys a vibrant free enterprise system, which is based on the idea of voluntary exchange, and that we benefit from such voluntary exchange. And when we sort of put in barriers to that, we destroy the idea of property rights and the cost of doing business, and industries can't gain, nor can they sort of enter, nor can they extract themselves, and that messes up the system, and that's where we are. What we want to do is talk about cronyism today, sort of how insidious it is, examples of the good, the bad, and the ugly. What perhaps can we do about it? We have 4 people here, one of whom, in case you haven't noticed, is not Chairman Hensarling. We found some pregnant lady. We thought she'd suffice to come in, so it's fine. But he may still make it. There are these things called votes that members of Congress are involved in, and he's likely involved with that. But Shannon is the staff director for the House Financial Services Committee, and so we'll put her at the end on the off chance that he makes it, and she'll have some comments on that. We have Tim Carney, who is, most importantly, he likes the phrase Enterprise Institute. What I mean by that is he used to be a fellow with the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and now he directs the Culture of Competition project at the American Enterprise Institute. So he just likes enterprise either way. It works fine. But you know, the funny thing about Tim is he's kind of been fighting cronyism since before it was cool to do that. So you may not like that, but that's what reality is. Nick Sorrentino, who is to his left, is the founder and editor of AgainstCronyCapitalism.org. It's a very subtle website, as we were talking earlier. In case you don't quite know what that's about, you need to go back and look at that. He's also the CEO of Excellerix Consultants, so it's nice to sort of have a capitalist understanding the defense that's necessary for capitalism. And then to my left, Mike Needham, is CEO of Heritage Action. Mike's one of those heritage lifers, really, who has done yeoman's work expanding heritage advocacy and effectiveness the last couple of years, especially among conservative lawmakers, so it's nice to mix things up. And then Shannon, as I mentioned, who's the staff director of the House Financial Services Committee. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to get out of the way. What we're going to do is each will talk for about 5 minutes or so, and then I may have a few questions to them, and then what time we have left, we will devote to you. So with that, let's have Tim go first, and we'll go right down the line.
Thank you, Lawson. I think it's pretty clear that the single biggest threat to free enterprise in America today is the big business lobby. It's not the far left. It's not Bernie Sanders. It's not the collectivists. It's not the people who would, nationalize all private property. It's the big business lobby that works together with government in order to try to increase their privilege, to try to get handouts, to try to get subsidies, to try to get bailouts, to try to get complex tax code that benefits them, and to try to get regulations that keep out competition. And they're the most dangerous, not because they're the most evil or anything like that, but because, for three reasons. One, they fool Republicans and other free market people into thinking that pro-business is really what they're supposed to be. Two, they fool the left and the center left and the mainstream media to conflate pro-business with pro-free enterprise, thus sullying the name of free enterprise, but also very simply because the big guys win. The environmentalists, the tree huggers, the college kids coming with their Birkenstocks and lobbying for big government this or that, they never end up getting what they want, really. When government grows, it's usually almost always because there was some powerful, large special interest behind it. Sometimes it's big labor. Sometimes it's just, the government itself. But a lot of times it's big business lobbying for bigger government. A great example of it fooling Republicans and big business causing a win has to do with light bulbs. The light bulb law was part of the 2007 energy bill. One of the two chief co-sponsors was Fred Upton, Republican congressman, who now is the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee. When he was trying to become chairman of Energy and Commerce, a bunch of conservatives said, "Why the heck did you take away our light bulbs? Why did you push this bill?" And he said at the time, "I was a little wary about it, because first he had pushed a bill to get all the federal government using the energy-efficient light bulbs. But I was a little wary about making everybody use it. But then GE and Sylvania, they came and they said it was fine." That was, in effect, what the Republican argument was. Oh, well, we don't like regulation, but if the single most affected industry says that this regulation is good, then we go along with it. That has literally been the thinking of a lot of Republican congressmen. And if you look at the biggest government things that Republicans have done, whether it's things like the light bulb law, the energy bill in 2005, the Medicare prescription drug bill, especially the bailout, they're all cases where big business was on the side of big government. Big business lobby wins when they push for bigger government, and they fool Republicans. But they also fool the mainstream media. Well, one more example of them winning is very simply Obamacare. The insurers made the opening bid right after Obama won, and they said, we will cover everybody as long as you require everybody to buy insurance and you give us subsidies. The drug lobbyists lobbied so hard for the bill, they cut a deal. They even ended up running ads to save Harry Reid because he shepherded Obamacare through in 2010. And then the hospitals, they were key in fighting for Obamacare in the Supreme Court cases, and on the state level, on the Medicaid expansion. When Republican governor expands Medicaid under Obamacare, it is always because the hospital lobby asked him to. But also, probably more importantly, they fool not just the Republican politicians and the people dedicated to free enterprise, but they fool the people in the middle. The people think, I kind of like free enterprise, but maybe the left is right when they say, oh, well, free enterprise is just a gift to big business. And then we say, no, it's not. It's about everybody competing fairly, and you only make a profit if you sell something that people want to buy, and you give it to them for a better price in a better manner, and then you go ahead and you subsidize Boeing. Or then you go ahead and you subsidize General Electric or Archer Daniel Midland or the tech industry or something like that. When that is done, when big government starts benefiting big business, it divorces the pursuit of profit from the quest to provide value for consumers, and instead ties profit to your political connections. And one of the fights today that highlights that very clearly, I think, is the Export-Import Bank, where it's a government agency that lends money or guarantees private loans to foreign buyers so they can buy U.S. goods. These are great American companies that are making things like jumbo jets and turbines and that sort of thing, and they should be able to sell them on their own. And when we say we support free enterprise, but we need the government there because these big exporters, well, they need some help because the international trade situation is difficult. You take away the moral underpinning for free enterprise, because free enterprise can't just be about maximizing wealth. It has to be a moral thing, and it is a moral thing. It's that we believe in free action. We believe that when people pursue profit in a free and open competition, it maximizes wealth for all. But if the free enterprise and capitalism is used as an excuse to defend just subsidizing big business, then it becomes what the left caricatures it to be, and then there's no justification for it. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Tim. Nick, why don't you? Sure. I'll let you go after.
Well, I'm Nick Sorrentino. I'm the editor and co-founder of AgainstCronyCapitalism.org. And I just have to say, everybody up here, my organization, big fans. Tim, I've read him for forever, and we feature him regularly. So I'd encourage you guys to check out his stuff often. We do. I want to tell you guys kind of where I came from, one of the reasons why I'm against crony capitalism. I grew up not particularly well off. My dad was a naval officer, but we weren't rich. He was from the swamps of Florida. And when I graduated from college with a significant amount of debt, there was no trust fund waiting for me. And I looked around and hustled for years. I spent 10 years as a commission salesperson selling investment products and insurance. And I learned what it takes to make a business, to make something grow, to initiate, to get people on your side and really help them, how free enterprise can help them have a better life. Anyway, crony capitalism is a challenge to the very heart of America. When the vested interests, the people with power, are able to seize the levers of Washington for their own benefit, what happens is a film forms over the economy. There's a group of people who are making tons and tons of money, while slowly the rest of us fall behind. Now, wealth disparity is something that is often in the news right now. And for instance, our good Vice President Biden said recently that it would be good to emancipate people's wealth. Well, this is coming from a guy who has made, a fortune in politics and has had the benefit of sweetheart real estate deals. Most of us don't have access to these things. But he gets wealthier. The political class gets wealthier. And as the rules get thicker and the red tape wraps around the economy ever tighter, entrepreneurs, people like me, the opportunities diminish. And so the middle class becomes poorer. The movement through the middle class to the upper class, which is a shame that we even use those terms in the United States. This is the United States of America, but the opportunities diminish. And now you are seeing a generation, the people younger than me, coming out of school, and it's dim for them. We're not starting businesses anymore. We're not creating opportunity. People are going into government now to make a fortune. Anybody know what the wealthiest city in the United States is, or metropolitan areas? Anybody? It is Washington, by far and away. And why is that? It's because it's ringed with defense contractors and federal employees that on average make $120,000 in annual compensation. That's ridiculous. All the wealth is being aggregated from the hinterlands into the capital city. It reminds me of a certain movie that has come out recently. Anyway, before I sit down, I wanted to make one more point. And it's something that a lot of folks who focus on crony capitalism don't spend a whole lot of time on. We spend a lot of time on banking. The co-founder, my partner, Hunter Lewis, is a very successful financier. The prime mover of crony capitalism is the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve undermines our system of free enterprise. And hopefully, we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Thank you.
So I agree completely with both of those points. I want to use my time. I'm conscious of the saying that everything's been said, but not everyone said it in Washington, to make the case that actually crony capitalism is the biggest threat to the Republican Party and its electoral success that's out there. It's something that feels good for politicians. You've got to raise $2 million, $12 million. The Speaker of the House has raised $100 million. And the easiest way to do it is to walk down the street from the Capitalism to Charlie Palmer's Steakhouse and collect checks from PACs. And so I understand why in the short term politicians do this. In the long term, I think it puts the Republican Party into a situation where there's no way for them to make a compelling case to the vast majority of the American people across the country. There was this incredible situation at the start of the lame duck session of Congress a couple months ago, where all of the media is reporting about the must-pass legislation that needs to get done. There's only 12 legislative days, and there's so much that needs to be done in those legislative days. How will they do it? And what they were talking about was a cromnibus which reauthorized something called OPIC, which Tim's done great work talking about, which is this slush fund of corporate welfare so that the Ritz-Carlton can build resorts in Turkey. That they needed to pass TRIA, which is a program that was created right after 9/11 to expire after a year, is allowed to continue to go on. 57 tax extenders for NASCAR so that they can get a special tax break. And it was all this stuff that actually there was not a single person outside of this very wealthy beltway that we were talking about that actually cares about whether TRIA or OPIC or the NASCAR tax break are reauthorized, because those aren't the concerns that real Americans have. Real Americans are concerned about stagnant wages. Real Americans are concerned about how you send your kid to college. Real Americans are concerned about energy and housing prices and all sorts of other issues. But that's not what Washington, D.C. means by must pass. This is a profound problem for the limited government party, right? For the left, a large capital with lots of power makes a ton of sense. It fits into your worldview. It fits into what you're trying to achieve. And you just have this minor problem of how do you allocate money to public sector unions and teacher unions and welfare and the Medicaid expansion, all these problems that the left is currently dealing with in state budgets. Margaret Thatcher kind of identified the genetic flaw with the left, and it's that the problem with socialism is you eventually run out of other people's money. The right has a very different problem. We have solutions to all of these different anxieties that real Americans face. If you're concerned about your stagnant wages, we got great solutions on labor unions, licensing requirements, the kind of ludicrous idea that you can't become a security guard in Michigan without 3 years of training. So some laid-off auto worker isn't allowed because of a government regulation to go into an industry that makes sense for them. We've got solutions on housing. Jeb Hensarling's done some of the best work in recent years on trying to address the kind of housing bubble that caused 2008, address housing prices, which are a real concern for American taxpayers. Healthcare, you go down the list, we have limited government, civil society solutions to all of the problems, but we run into this kind of genetic flaw that the Republican Party has, which is that you elect men to Washington, D.C. to grab the levers of power, and then instead of using those levers of power to reward all the people that we were just talking about, to reward those campaign donors, you're supposed to give it back to the people. You're supposed to devolve it down to the states. You're supposed to respect the role of civil society. And the problem that we find is that the great state of Ohio has not sent Cincinnatus to Washington, D.C. It's sent John Boehner. And so it's very unlikely that we're actually going to achieve this. And so the Republican Party has come up with a reason to elect Republicans that's very different from the reason that voters send Republicans to Washington. It's that we're going to prove that we can govern. Or more specifically, we're going to prove to the New York Times beat writer or the CBS News producer that Republicans are responsible enough to govern. And what they mean by governing is talking about all those pieces of legislation which are at their core corrupt or at their core about what the interests of K Street lobbyists are. The tax breaks, TRIA, all of these, the Export-Import Bank, which will be one of the big ones this year. The sense of governing necessarily means that you don't have conflict. If you want to see this, the best example is on the Farm Bill, and you can find any think tank from right to left, the Urban Institute, would agree that on the Farm Bill, ag subsidies are fundamentally wrong. It's corporate welfare. It's unfair to people all around the world who should be doing farming instead of corn farmers in Iowa. But the Farm Bill was hailed after 2 years of conflict as some great moment of bipartisan governing because a bill was passed that continued the same Soviet-style ag policies that have existed in this country for 70 years. But because Washington governed, because something got done, because the crony capitalists on K Street could praise it, this was seen as something that was an achievement for the Republican Party to do. If the Republican Party is going to win, if conservatives are going to win, we need to prove to Americans that we have solutions other than government, that solutions exist in this world that exists in between the individual and government that can solve their anxieties, that can solve wage concerns, that can solve price concerns. And you cannot do that as long as you have to pay tribute to the lobbyists in Washington, D.C. and this crony culture that exists. I'm profoundly optimistic that we're going to win this. I think that when you look at what technology has done, websites like Against Crony Capitalism, you could not fathom getting the message out in the way conservatives are today. You think about the export-import fight and something where 90% of the money given out by the Export-Import Bank is going to places like Boeing and GE and Caterpillar. The rest goes to Latin American drug cartels, oligarchs in Russia. I'm not making this up. I couldn't make this up. The richest woman in Australia gets XM loans. You couldn't have exposed that 50 years ago. It's easy for the left 50 years ago to organize themselves. You go to the gates of a factory, people get off work, and you organize them into a labor union. Organizing the forgotten man is much tougher, and I think technology through websites like Against Crony Capitalism, what we're doing at Heritage Action with a network of sentinels across the country who are getting engaged, these are the mechanisms that can exist today because of the role of technology that let us kind of fundamentally change the supply and demand for crony capitalism. And so I'm profoundly optimistic. But if the Republican Party does not break this link, if the Republican Party keeps making decisions based on how we can govern so that the people who give us our campaign checks can be happy, so that they write more campaign checks, you're never going to reach out to middle-class Americans, working Americans, who have real anxieties and are frustrated by a system that doesn't do anything to address them.
Okay, Shannon, you've been teed up for the Ex-Im Bank, so that was well done.
And I'm going to use that pregnancy card that you mentioned earlier and have seated with my notes here, if that's okay. Again, my apologies that I'm not Chairman Hensarling, and I'm going to be disappointing compared to what he would be able to share with you, but I really appreciate the opportunity to address the issue of cronyism and to talk a little bit about how the committee that he chairs, which is the Financial Services Committee in the House, is involved in this issue. Can everyone hear me okay? The mic doesn't light up, so I'm going to be obnoxious and do a quick pop quiz. Who here knows why former Congressman Bill Jefferson is in jail right now? Who is not named Tim Carney and did not write the book on cronyism? Yes, sir.
Well, I know they caught him keeping money in a freezer.
You got it. Do you remember how much money? How much money do you think you can fit in a freezer?
Was it $700,000?
It was about $90,000. But do you know why, what he did to deserve that prison sentence?
I'm a bit rusty on that.
He was involved with bribes with the Export-Import Bank. And there was another staff member who worked for the Ex-Im Bank who I believe, again, let me reach my notes here, I believe had about $100,000 in bribes that were involved with this and end up with punishment because of the same case. Another item that you might have heard of is Solyndra. Solyndra is another company that has not had the best track record that also resulted in using Export-Import Bank loans in order to keep the bank afloat after using the stimulus money. It didn't work. So we have, you can go to our website, it's financialservices.house.gov/blog. It's not the sexiest of all the URLs, but we have number after number after number of these kind of egregious deals that have existed with the bank that the American public deserve to know. The bank may be small by DC standards. It's about $140 billion. Most of this money is not going to American companies so that they can survive or that they can succeed in a tough economy. This money is going to foreign countries. This is going to businesses that might not have the best track record so that they can have either getting direct loans or getting guarantees or things that, like I mentioned, Tim has written quite a bit on. So I would just encourage you all to try to get to know this. The reason why in the cronyism debate that the Export-Import Bank is so important is that this is an achievable victory. This is a program that is going to expire at the end of June. There is a great deal of controversy around this bank, and there are different opinions on this. You have some members of Congress who obviously think that it might be important in order to get more jobs because we obviously need more help in that area. But this comes down to the fundamental question: are you free market? Are you free enterprise? Or are you for giving subsidies? And we're trying to make the case that this is not something that in the long run is really helping the American economy and these companies. Just to go quickly through this, again, I know this is specific to Ex-Im, but I just want to make sure that everyone knows the facts about this program so that you have this information and that you're armed as this debate comes up. 5 quick things to know about the bank. Everyone says the bank creates jobs and that we need it in order to have jobs. Actually, there is no real study that shows that it creates jobs. It can just move jobs among the economy, that jobs that are going to be created because they're putting in an iron ore iron ore plant in Australia by Australia's richest woman that's taking business away from another iron ore company that is in the United States, that they're not getting the benefit of that program, but it's going into Australia instead. Also, the bank does not necessarily send money back to taxpayers. That's something that has been challenged as well, that, oh, well, they don't pay, taxpayers don't pay any money, so what's the problem? Well, if you actually put in real accounting standards, you would see that we actually have to pay for this program. This is something that's pure cronyism, and that taxpayers are paying for this for GE and Boeing and some other companies that use it the most. One item that, again, Tim used that we like to use is that only 1% of America's small businesses actually benefit from XM. 1% of exports are being used through this program. It's not 50% of all exports need this program. So again, these are just things that I think it would be very helpful for people to remember. Again, I mentioned that this money goes to foreign corporations and it goes to businesses that are owned by China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. It's not going directly to American companies. And then the last is that it finances only 1% of all U.S. exports total. And we can pass this out to you, but 1% of all exports are going through this very small Washington, D.C. bank. So again, thank you for letting us have the opportunity to talk to you about it. I'm going to put in another plug for Tim's boss, who is Arthur Brooks over at AEI, who has, if you haven't read his material, I'd highly recommend it. But the greatest job and happiness engine is free enterprise, people having the ability to earn success. And I think that that's a major part of cronyism, is giving people the ability to make their own decisions on how to, make their business work and to make people happy.
Thank you. Let me ask a few questions of you all that hopefully are indicative of what folks are thinking, and then we'll open up to the floor. This is sort of a chicken and an egg question. Nick brought up the fact that Washington, D.C. has seen significant growth in terms of our housing prices and incomes and whatnot, and so we obviously selfishly benefit that, but that's not something that was true 30, 40 years ago. Agriculture subsidies and financial interests in government have been intertwined for some time. It wasn't just a 2008 kind of a thing. So what happened first? Was this private companies coming to politicians to seek either favors or to create regulatory environments that were anti-competitive? Was this politicians going to private companies sort of to begin this rent-seeking mechanism for sort of the thank you of politics? Which came first? Which is more prevalent now, if that's even something that we can understand? And I'd open up to anybody. So,
I mean, this is sort of this is like asking about creationism and evolution and the Big Bang Theory, right? So we need Scott Walker to answer. No. So the one story I look at, though, is the story of Microsoft in the late 90s, where their lobbying office was in the corner of their Bethesda, Maryland sales office. The sales office Microsoft had for the DC area, there was a guy there who was like the weird guy because he didn't sell Microsoft. He was a lobbyist. And now they have this gleaming tower. You should go and check it out. I think it's on like 11th and K. It's one of the most beautiful lobbying buildings on K Street. What happened? In 1998, Congress, Republican Congress, called him before, as the Clinton administration was beating them up, was beating Bill Gates and Microsoft up for antitrust violations. And one of the Orrin Hatch staffers said, these guys were so arrogant. They thought they could just, as long as they were just creating jobs and making software, that they could just ignore Washington. And I mean, when I called, when that started happening to Apple this time around, when they were criticized because they don't even have a political action committee, the gall they have, their lobbying is only, what, $1 million a year, or $1 million a quarter, I don't know. It's half of what Google's is, which is half of what Microsoft's is, or the other way around. But when I called some other lobbyists about this, who identifies as a Republican and a conservative, he's like, well, yeah, that's just stupid. That's just arrogance. You can't just think that you're too good for lobbying. So, but what if you don't really want to ask for anything? Well, tough, and that's the story. But now, Microsoft, guess what? Guess what side they were on the net neutrality side, net neutrality debate. They were pushing for regulations. So I think the chicken and egg thing happens, that government beats them up, they come into town, And then their lobbyists help convince the CEOs, you need to be friends with government and not just sort of ward them off.
Anybody else?
Yeah. Boy, you're very right there, Tim. I just wanted to, talk about the historical nature of government and private enterprise. I often have a debate with folks on my website, and they say, well, my liberal readers, they say, well, what we really need is good governance. We just need good people to get into government and we'll solve this problem. And I say, no. The only way you solve the cronyism or crony capitalism issue is you shrink the size of the state. It is the state that is the catalyst for crony capitalism or cronyism or whatever. And it goes back to the very first days of the state. I mean, probably Hammurabi back in the, people were lobbying him and his people, to get a special privilege. I mean, that is just the nature of the beast. So the only legitimate attack, if we really believe that this is an issue that we need to attack, and I'm telling you, I really think it is, you have to reduce the size of government. There's no other way around it. You can't have, special lobbyist rules or restrictions on this or restrictions on that. It's not going to happen. You have to reduce the size of the state. And I don't know if you've noticed, I don't think we've ever done that. So we really need to start thinking about doing that.
I think that's all right. I mean, I think there's no doubt government wants this system set up the way they are. The reason, for example, tax extenders expire every year or two is so the lobbyists will have to come by and cut their campaign checks. And if you permanently extended any of this stuff, the campaign checks would dry up. At the same time, we should talk about the role of business in it also. And you look at something like what's going on with Airbnb up in New York, where the hotel industry is aggressively and with clear knowledge of what they're doing, trying to use regulation to keep Airbnb out, defining what a hotel is, trying to define Airbnb out of the space. You look at Duke Energy supporting cap and trade. An electric company should not be supporting cap and trade, except that it's a barrier to entry for some smart guy to come in and start a company that disrupts the model. So as the question posited, it's a chicken and the egg type of thing. Government wants it to go on, but there's plenty of business out there that's not petitioning government for redress of grievance. They're petitioning government for protection from a disruptor to come in and blow up their business model. I mean, I graduated Stanford Business School a couple years ago. 2 years before I got there, they revised their core curriculum to add a class alongside accounting and marketing and finance on lobbying Washington, D.C. because you're better off as a CEO today, and I'd do it if I were a Fortune 50 CEO, coming to Washington and asking them to protect your business model than actually investing in the R&D or new business model that lets you create jobs and grow the economy.
Shannon, do you want to hear?
I think it was a terrific question, and just want to remind everybody about the history of cronyism in our country. Does anybody remember the reason why we had the Boston Tea Party? Anyone want to offer it up? Right, exactly. It's not just because we were taxed for the cost of tea, it's because the East India Tea Company was not taxed, that they were getting special protections, special cronyism compared to what the taxpayers were paying. And so remembering that that's a basic unfairness that is a strong history in our country, and that we need to keep that in mind.
And I would add that some shareholders were members of Parliament. So
There you go. So we've mentioned Exim Bank. We've mentioned the general idea of agricultural subsidies and financial services. So what would be your one or two sort of hall of shame right now that if we could wave the magic wand, it would either be the elimination of a program, it might be a change of regulation, it might even be a change of sort of open door, revolving door policy, but what would be each of your sort of two hall of shame that we should make as our priorities? I'll just work right down the list.
Well, I would start with the export-import. I mean, I think if you look 10 years ago, why did we win the earmark fight in Congress? And it was because of the bridge to nowhere. Specifically, it was right after Hurricane Katrina when the bridge down in New Orleans was destroyed, and there was an amendment put forth by Tom Coburn saying, why don't we take the money that was designated for the bridge to nowhere in Alaska and redirect it down to Louisiana, and that amendment failed. I think it failed overwhelmingly. It was like 92 votes against it in the Senate. And so the bridge to nowhere became the poster child that allowed people all across the country to understand the larger problem of earmarks, and that's the Export-Import Bank. I mean, it literally is indefensible, and Shannon and Tim have done great work talking about why that is. But I think that to the extent that the Export-Import Bank over the past couple of years, the next couple of weeks and months and beyond, becomes the poster child for crony capitalism. That's what allows everybody around the country to recognize the problem, understand how we defeat the problem, and get that kind of fundamental sense of fairness back into how government works.
I would say XM, and then the other two would be the ethanol mandate and the sugar program.
Because I'm a writer and I live outside of Washington, I'm allowed to dream a little more than these folks.
dream.
That XM, if we could take that down, that would be fantastic. But I will say that if we can get the audit the Fed bill to the president where he has to veto it and put him on the spot, I mean, that's what they're fighting. They want to keep it from going to the president, so he has to protect his Wall Street crony friends. We need to make him go on the record. So if I could eliminate anything, I'd just start with the Federal Reserve.
I think after my remarks that it's obviously the Export-Import Bank, but another one that our committee works with is putting an end to the concept of too big to fail. And I know we talked earlier about the 2008 financial crisis, and there's a Dodd-Frank Act, which was the Democrats' response to that. But another one is declaring that certain large banks and are considered too big to fail, and that they get to have special protection while some of the smaller banks are suffering. So that's something that we're working on as well.
I'm going to put in a shameless plug because I can. The Competitive Enterprise Institute likes to do a lot of things, but suing the government is one of them. There is a Supreme Court case next week on Obamacare that is actually our case. The other case that is sort of hidden behind the wings is we actually are challenging the constitutionality of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and the notion of too big to fail. That is happening, but it's a long road. Okay, last question before I turn it over to the larger population here. We have the Hall of Shame. We have a few other ideas, but we've also seen Ex-Im Bank pass before. We have seen the Farm Bill pass when seemingly everybody hates it, and I mean everybody. Both sides. So what kind of a coalition do we need to actually put together to get some of these things either off the books? Tim's talked about how do we get special interests to fight one another. So what are some ideas, both as inside the beast, if you will, nothing personal, Shannon, and outside? How can we actually put together groups of individuals or entities that might actually move some of this forward? So
I'll talk about getting turning the special interests against the other special interests, and let you guys talk more about inside congressional stuff. If you look, there was a subsidy created by Dodd-Frank called the TAG, Transaction Account Guarantee. It was like FDIC insurance, but if your deposits could go up to infinity and they would still be insured by the government. Now, of course, banks loved this. People with deposits between $250,000 and infinity also liked it, but they weren't necessarily lobbying on it. The banks liked the idea of having this backup from the government. But the main people who liked it was the community banks. And the credit unions had just gotten really upset at the community banks because the community banks had just lobbied to take away some of the credit unions' special favors because they're tax exempt. So because of that, the credit unions started lobbying against TAG. But you know who else did? It was the mutual funds who realized that people were keeping money in these banks instead of putting it in mutual funds because they had a guarantee in the banks. So none of this is pretty. None of this is stuff I would be proud of. But the mutual funds and the credit unions started lobbying against the subsidy, and it died. And now we've gotten luxury. Now we've gotten a little bit of advancing the ball on XM, and it has to do with getting a chairman of financial services that we have now. It has to do with Heritage Action taking up the ball. It also helps that we have a company that realized that they're being hurt. Mike referred to the forgotten man as a victim of most of these subsidies. Sometimes they realize it. Delta realizes that their foreign competitors are getting XM subsidies. So having them go out, if we could organize the other victims of XM, which is very difficult to do, that would help. But you've seen it on other things too, where the subsidies usually, the cost is diffuse among taxpayers, but the distortions they have on the economy sometimes have very specific victims. And maybe, it can be a project of Heritage Action or a brand new think tank startup, identify those victims, show them that they're suffering, and bring them together to lobby against the special favors.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I agree completely with all of that. I mean, we're conservatives here. We're at CPAC. We believe in markets, and the market price for cronyism has changed in recent years. The amount of money that Boeing has had to spend defending the Export-Import Bank, which had a vote a couple of years ago. Before that, I don't think it had ever been voted on the floor of the House, has been astronomical. It is more expensive for Boeing to defend its corporate cronyism in the federal government. They will demand less of it. It is far cheaper for us today to organize Americans around the country to get them the type of information they need. And so I think the solution to most of this comes from arming Americans with the information they need. I'm firmly convinced that you will never on any issue get 218 members of Congress to do the right thing because they thought about the issue and just decided to vote the right way. They're going to do it because their interests are aligned. You saw that on the Farm Bill. The reason Farm Bills go forward is that there's this nexus between people who want food stamps and people, Republicans largely from square states in the Midwest, who want farm subsidies, has come together and passed a Farm Bill despite concerns on the conservative right and the liberal left. That coalition is falling apart because it cost $109 million and 2 years for the House of Representatives to pass a Farm Bill a couple years ago, which has led Mike Conaway, the new agriculture chairman, to say the next time they do that, they're going to break the nexus between those two things. And so the ability that we have today to get information out, to bring that forgotten man in to the conversation, to change Washington not from the inside out. I mean, Heritage was started in 1973 because the missing piece was that there were all sorts of wonderful books written, and Hayek and Russell Kirk, AEI was writing books that thick, but nobody on Capitol Hill had time to read them. And so there was a lack of information that existed on Capitol Hill. What we decided a couple of years ago at Heritage was this think tank model of just putting out white papers and having access to Capitol Hill. Well, if that's what it took, we would have won by now. There's plenty of think tanks with access to Capitol Hill and good ideas. What there aren't are efforts to get the American people from the outside in to come and change Washington. And I think unless you're trying to do that effort, you're paddling upstream against a town that has hundreds of millions of dollars on every single issue to convince members of Congress that despite they might want to do the right thing, they have to do something else if they want to survive.
So, absolutely. One of the reasons why AgainstCronyCapitalism.org exists is it's a call to arms, to the broader public. Washington may have the heavy artillery, a lot of money, a lot of rules and regs you got to work through, but the people who are against cronyism are legion. When I talk to people online, thousands of people, we often get, hundreds, thousands of comments on an article. And they're saying, how can this be? How can this happen? And I guarantee you, if 1,000 people pick up the phone and start calling members of Congress, things will happen. And they have happened. We've just started to see that. So essentially, getting the American people to actively lobby, to get out there and get the people who care to focus their energy in Washington to draw, focus their fire, essentially. That's how we may make a change.
Shannon, anything to add?
Well, I agree with the other panelists that comparing it to the earmark debate, and it took multiple Congresses before we were able to convince folks that, yes, the Bridge to Nowhere and others are terrible ideas, and similar with XM, there's just the education campaign. You just have to let folks know where to get this information and what kind of projects are actually happening. So again, I encourage you all, if you want to go to our website, all of their websites as well. #EndXM has been used by many folks to get the word out as well.
And tell the stories. Stories are very effective. So, some questions. Yes, sir.
Yes, it's very disheartening to hear what you are describing. I wouldn't even call cronyism based on the Apple and Microsoft anecdotes. It's a protection racket the government is running, forcing companies to pay to legislators. And even worse than that, I believe this phenomenon is totally undermining the conservatives among the Republican Party and even encouraging treason. For the first point, Rush Limbaugh last week...
Sir, do you have a question?
Okay. The treason part. I spoke to Mr. Schlapp last week at the Monday meeting, and I asked him why David Horowitz and Paolo Geller are no longer invited, and he refused to answer. I think it's because
Okay, sir, I can't speak to Matt Schlapp and CPAC. You have a question about cronyism for this particular panel.
The money that the Arabs are pouring and
Okay.
subverting our legislators, I think, should also be part of the equation.
Okay, you have a question, yeah.
Hi, yes, this is mostly a question for Shannon, although the others want to weigh in. My name is Dave Thomas. I'm a reporter with Inside U.S. Trade. We do a lot of XM coverage. Chairman Hensarling has been fairly clear in his position on the Export-Import Bank. But with the introduction in the past month or so of reauthorization bills from Congressman Fincher and from House Democrats this past week, will the chairman allow any of those bills to be brought up before the committee for a hearing, a markup, a vote, or will he insist that none of these legislation come?
He's been very open about having conversations with members. These were going on in the last Congress as well as this Congress, so he can continue with that. But there's also been quite a few meetings of just bringing in members and answering questions. There are a lot of questions out there about the reforms that occurred in the 22 reauthorization. Many of them were lacking, and I'd be happy to give you some specific details and hearings that we've had with XM officials where these reforms simply aren't occurring. So happy also chat with you afterwards. I give you my card and we can give you more information.
I think it's a great issue. Heritage Action did a campaign last week, robocalls into the districts of everybody who's a co-sponsor of the Steve Fincher bill, and I think every Republican has the responsibility to tell their constituents how on earth they could be in favor of reauthorizing what I think is the most inexcusable form of corporate cronyism in the federal government.
And I think it's wonderful. Quick note, the sponsor, am I right, that the sponsor of the Democratic bill is Maxine Waters? So this is to your average Republican, not even a CPAC attendee, say, one side of the XM fight is Paul Ryan, the other side is Maxine Waters. Which side are you on?
Right here.
You might know. Don't ask the question if you don't know the answer.
I'm not sure which bill you're talking about, but there was there's one that was, I think as Tim mentioned, was offered by Democrats, and there was another one that's offered by Republican on the committee. And so, of course, they were all welcome to have their ideas and different reforms. There were others at last Congress as well, but there was, I believe, one fly-in that was sponsored by I think it was a National Association of Manufacturers and others who are supporting it, but there was also fly-in. You have companies like Delta who said that there are jobs that they're losing competitive advantages because of XM. So there are other companies out there who are negatively impacted by XM, and so again, we just encourage to read up as much as possible. Sure. No, I mean, he's the chairman of the committee, obviously, and so determining kind of how the schedule works, but he's also one member and one vote. So,
Right.
He's right now working with members, anybody who will listen and discuss what's going on with the future
Let's
of the
go
bank.
to the right in the corner here,
Hi, Chris Ashram. Nobody is doing more, I think, than Heritage Action, it's fair to say, to bring a spotlight on crony capitalism. My concern is that this seems to have permeated deeply into the top leadership of the GOP, who seem to be comfortable doing business this way. Mike, what kind of progress do you think we're really making to change some attitudes or just change some people?
Well, look, I think Eric Cantor lost in no small part because his district felt that he'd become a creature of Washington, D.C., a creature of mainly Wall Street, I think more than K Street. In that particular case, the day of the primary in Virginia 7, Eric Cantor was up doing a fundraiser at Starbucks. And so I think that message is getting out there. There's no doubt that if you're a member of Congress, you show up on your first day, you're one of 435, you're at the back of the back bench, and you're looking at how do I advance my career, how do I advance issues that I care about, it's very tempting to go raise a lot of money, to play the game. As I tried to say in my remarks, I think that the Republican Party is fundamentally in a box if we try to play the K Street game. We can't show how limited government, civil society solutions can take all of the anxieties that are very real, that people sitting around their tables look at, and say, how do I afford to send my kid to college? Well, the reason the cost of college is high is probably more so than any other area, completely a construct of the federal government, and an accreditation cartel, student loan student loan programs that are out of control. And so if you want to be able to go home and explain to somebody who's concerned about sending their kid to college about why the Republican Party has a different vision than Barack Obama, you need to be willing to take on a whole lot of sacred cows in Washington, D.C. By definition, that will mean that you're causing conflict. By definition, that means that reporters who don't want to dig into an issue or cronies on K Street who want to paint you the wrong way are going to say this guy's disruptive, he throws bombs, he's not part of governing, he wants to raise money or grow an email list and not get stuff done. But if conservatives have a different solution than a highly federalized, progressive vision of Washington, D.C.'s role, we're going to break some China in Washington. And I think the most encouraging thing is you have people at CEI, Tim Carney, everyone on stage, who has been willing to be disruptive. And that's the only chance we have to win.
And I'll add that I think if you look at the Republican leadership right now, I mean, this might be an unpopular thing to say, but their heart is generally in a conservative place and generally in the right place on this. Kevin McCarthy has said on national TV, without any ambiguity, that he opposes Export-Import Bank. He's the House Majority Leader. Steve Scalise, number 3 guy, he's voted against the Export-Import Bank. Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, opposes the Export-Import Bank. So all of them know in their heart that this is wrong. The thing is that they have so much pull. They're being pulled so hard by K Street in the opposite direction. And there's not as much ability to pull on the other side because the profit motive isn't as strong. You do have groups. You've got, the Club for Growth and Heritage Action, and to a much smaller extent, Delta and these guys pulling in that direction. But they want to do the right thing. It's just really hard. And, hard for them to do the right thing.
Let me end by actually reminding everybody of an anecdote in 2008 when, does anybody know what happened, the very, very first vote that took place for the bailout bill? It failed fairly badly. Stock market reacted negatively, et cetera, and the reality was a couple days later, they changed their mind, in part because there wasn't a lot there. There weren't a lot of groups everybody was caught off guard to sort of say, here's why you need to vote against this, here's how we can encourage it. That vacuum wasn't there, and in part, that bill passed. That situation is a little different today, but all the more reason why we need to remain active. These 4 are not going anywhere. If you have additional questions, come up and find them, but it is after time, so I want to make sure we end this. And thank you to the 4 of you, and thank you all for coming.